and welcome back to another episode of the Self-Development with Tactics podcast with me, your host, Christopher. It's been actually quite some time since I've done the quote-unquote intro in this way. What are we going to do today? Today, we are once again going to quote-unquote react. We're just going to watch an Andrew Huberman video from the Andrew Huberman Lab cast, or Huberman Lab podcast, by the way. This is a podcast, and also this here is a podcast. Therefore, if you're not having the time, especially when it comes to the original content, the video by Andrew Huberman, if you're not having the time, and I think this is just totally clear that this may not be the case for quite a lot of people, if you're not having the time and energy to go through it while watching the video, even if you are having it in background or whatever, there is still the podcast. But yeah, today it's going to be about dopamine and maybe even about writing. I'm having one video in mind that I might incorporate, but I do not really know yet. Let me just get rid of this and that and the other thing. Let's do this and have a look at what we're gonna view today. So there we go. The video is called Optimize and Control Your Brain Chemistry to Improve Health and Performance from, as I said, Andrew Huberman and the Andrew Huberman Lab podcast number 80. I think it is not that old of a video, but I don't have the exact date. Once again, I'm sorry. I kind of have to. What if I do this? Can I? Anyway, let's see. I'm gonna skip a few things as always because I do not want to go through all of it. But let's check this one out at first.
You want to be more in pursuit of goals, and you want to have more energy and to be more focused. There are many ways to go about that. In fact, there's a near infinite cloud of opportunities, everything from prescription drugs to illicit drugs, which I certainly do not recommend, supplements, nutrition. You can listen to particular music. You can do all sorts of cognitive, behavioral, nutritional supplementation tricks. Or you can just understand that what you're really after are increases in dopamine above baseline that you control. And there are ways to control them that are quite potent. And science tells us which tools are going to be the most potent and the most versatile for you. So I'm going to share those tools with you now with the caveat that each one of those tools could be its own entire podcast episode and that we've done near entire episodes on each of these tools or small collections of these tools. So I'm going to cover these in somewhat superficial manner. We can provide links to previous episodes that relate to each of these tools in detail, but I'll give you enough detail about them that would allow you to incorporate them into your routine should you choose. Let's say you want to increase dopamine for sake of increasing motivation. The first thing to do is to understand what the natural behavioral tools are for increasing dopamine and to do those as consistently as possible.
Just as a caveat from my side, on a recent episode also from the Andrew Huberman Lab podcast, I think, I'm actually not quite sure, I've been actually watching quite a few videos of him at this point now, but I think it was the Seattle Q&A, so you might check it out. I've also uploaded it yesterday, a reaction, or me watching it and giving a bit of caveats too. But there was also a question about dopamine and whether you learn better by applying dopamine or having dopamine, more dopamine in your bloodstream and or in your body and whatnot. And he said yes, when dopamine is there, whatever you're experiencing is being remembered better, period. So you might check yesterday's episode out or the original episode out to have the full information. But it also makes sense when you're trying to learn something, when you're trying to memorize something. Maybe that you kind of make yourself like what you're doing, and or at least maybe structure your day in a way that you secrete more dopamine when going through your materials, or you're doing this, that, and the other thing. Whatever you're trying, I think, to excel at, it would make sense to, structure your day around that. Maybe if you're quite serious about, becoming better, or just, improving in this certain aspect of life, which doesn't also has to be the case necessarily. And there's also part of this video, I think, I haven't watched it fully yet. At some point I probably have, but I didn't do it before the episode or recording. But there might be one which is about behavior and serotonin and having certain behavior that increases serotonin and dopamine, I think. So yeah, we'll see then later.
Again, these are tools that you'll want to do nearly every day, if not every day. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record on this one, but here again, we come to sunlight, and I should say not just the desire to, but really the need for viewing the maximum amount of sunlight that one can reasonably get, given schedules and locations in the world, time of year, etc., in the early part of the day. Within the first hour of waking, ideally, but certainly in the first 3 hours of your day, you are going to want to maximize sunlight exposure to your eyes. Never look at the sun or any other light so bright that it's painful to look at. And yes, of course, blinking is fine, but no, take sunglasses off, go outside once the sun is out and get some natural light in your eyes. And if it's appropriate, or I should say in a way that's appropriate, maximize the amount of sunlight exposure to your skin, but please don't get burned. Please do wear sunscreen if you're prone to getting burned. Typically, early day sunlight is not going to burn you, at least not most people, unless you're extremely fair-skinned. So don't get burned. Do what you need to in order to protect yourself from burn. There's some emerging controversy about sunscreen and which ones are safe and which ones aren't safe. We have not done an episode on that yet, but I find it to be an important and interesting topic. Dr. Daria Rose, I should say, has a podcast called the Daria Rose Podcast and did an episode all about sunscreens, which are safe, which are not safe, by interviewing an expert on that. So I refer you to that podcast as it relates to sunscreen. But get some natural light exposure in your eyes. And if you wake up before the sun comes out, turn on as many bright lights inside as you can turn on reasonably, given your electric bill, etc. Get a lot of bright sunlight exposure early in the day. And
there may be certain lights that, don't want to say simulate the light from the sun, which I think is not quite possible, even if it is daylight lamps, I think they're called. I have heard or read or just, whatever, something around that, even though they are really bright and they apparently are there to actually kind of do this. It is not quite the case, but I would have to look that up again, or one would have to make research or do the research to make sure that the lamp is actually doing what it is supposed to be doing, and that it is. I don't necessarily know if it is about the brightness itself or if there are some other reasons why. There is a difference, but maybe looking that up and checking it out if, and I have been in this position, if you're waking up in maybe either such conditions and or at certain times where it's just not possible to, go outside and actually have sunlight in your eyes and or on your skin, just because it is so early in the day or so early in the morning, and period.
And get a lot of sunlight exposure to your skin in the early part of the day in a way that doesn't burn you, meaning burn your skin, or blind you. Please don't do anything that harms your vision, like stare into bright light that's painful. What does that do? Well, it sets in motion a number of different biological cascades. Some are very fast. There are fast actions of sunlight that will trigger, for instance, dopamine release from different parts of your brain and your endocrine system. And we now know that it increases levels of genes related to thyroid hormone and actually increases certain dopamine receptors. So there's a wonderful paper. We will provide a link to this paper that shows that sunlight exposure can actually increase the amount of so-called DRD4. This is a particular type of dopamine receptor, the dopamine receptor 4. The genes for dopamine receptor 4 are actually under photic control. So if you get sunlight exposure to your eyes, and it does have to be to your eyes in the early part of the day, you increase the amount of dopamine receptor that you have, which allows whatever circulating dopamine happens to be there to have a greater effect on motivation, and I should say also on mood and feelings of being in pursuit and generally in craving and pursuit of things in life. Now, there's another way to increase the effect of whatever dopamine happens to be circulating in your brain and body. And this again relates to increasing the number or the efficacy of the receptors for dopamine. Now, here we're not talking about the dopamine receptor 4, but a different category of dopamine receptors, the D2 and D3 receptors, which are expressed multiple places in your brain.
As far as I do remember, he's now only talking about caffeine, which increases the amount of receptors also long-term, which makes it really interesting. So it's not a short-term thing like, okay, I'm going to sip my fucking coffee now that I'm not having, but I'm having a bit of water. And then I am happier and I'm feeling better and there is more dopamine in my fucking bloodstream. No, it's also apparently doing it long-term, which is quite amazing. And I was wondering, are those people in the blue zones? Because I do not quite remember. Are there also consuming caffeine in any way, if it is, whether it's caffeine, yeah, of course, whether it is coffee or yerba mate tea or tea in general, I wonder, because there might be some potential for people that are not consuming caffeine already. There are some people, and I, for quite some time, have been such a person. But, there might be some potential to actually, increase your, probably your set point of feeling good. And, but he's also saying 200 to 300 milligram.
And bind dopamine, meaning dopamine parks in them like a parking spot and allows dopamine to generally increase the activity of the neurons and cells that express those dopamine receptors. How do you do that? Well, turns out that regular ingestion of caffeine at safe and appropriate levels of about 100 to 250 milligrams is going to increase the number of D2 and D3 dopamine receptors. I talked a little bit about this on a previous episode. Again, we'll provide links to these studies, but this is an important finding, I believe, because this is not about the acute.
Yes, it's not about acute, but it is long term. Then we, of course, have deliberate cold exposure, which is spiking adrenaline and epinephrine, which is adrenaline or noradrenaline, I think is some sort of a precursor to dopamine. So definitely also something to check out. But I do want to point out and underline the behavioral
Serotonin,
things.
as I mentioned earlier, is associated with brain and body states of well-being, of comfort, of satiety. And therefore, it should come as no surprise that a lot of the prescription drug treatments for things like depression involve increasing levels of serotonin in the brain and body. That said, anytime you talk about prescription drugs for serotonin, we also want to acknowledge that there are often side effects associated with increasing serotonin. In particular, if serotonin levels go too high, that is, if the dosages of those treatments go too high, people will, for instance, feel reduced appetite, reduced libido, increased lethargy, etc. And there's a so-called serotonergic syndrome. All of that can and should be considered with a...
Just stepping in again, I do once again want to point out the episode is called Optimize and Control Your Brain Chemistry to Improve Health and Performance from the Huberman Lab podcast number 80. I am solely using it. I'm not republishing it, but solely using it as a source. I do want to underline that I am not willing to be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to re-upload it just because I'm getting tons of views from watching somebody else's videos. I do know, and I've looked it up, that the legal side of reaction videos and the legal side of, kind of basically uploading other people's videos is a bit, well, let's call it dangerous, There are some caveats to it, and I do want to underline it is a source for what I think is important and I believe should be known, as a way to spread information that is very useful, I believe, at least for quite some people. Period.
Well-trained physicians, so because they're prescription drugs, controlling the dosage, deciding what dosage to take, deciding which SSRI to take, and whether or not to come off those drugs, how to come off those drugs. Again, all of that should be handled a licensed physician. That said, there are behavioral tools, nutritional tools, and supplementation tools that can tap into the serotonin system, not to the same degree in potency, but nonetheless in ways that can still impact our feelings of well-being in positive ways. So let's focus first on the behavioral tools. And some of these might make people chuckle a little bit. I want to point out that a lot of these tools are quite potent. In fact, they are power tools for modulating serotonin. And we know that based on human neuroimaging studies, human and animal microdialysis studies, other studies that really have evaluated circulating levels of serotonin and the particular brain circuits that release serotonin when people do certain things. What sorts of things? Well, for instance, physical contact, in particular with loved ones. This can be romantic love. This can be children, so your own children, or your spouse, even if it's not sexual contact, friend-to-friend contact, even friend-to-animal contact. As a former dog owner, I hope to have another dog soon because unfortunately Costello passed away. But there is something really comforting and wonderful about petting your dog. And certainly, given that many of the studies on serotonin and these other neuromodulators were done on animal models, we also know that serotonin is being evoked in the dog and, of course, in the child and in the significant other, et cetera. So things like holding hands, believe it or not, hugs, cuddling, etc., can increase serotonin transmission, and they make people feel good. This shouldn't really come as a surprise. There's also gratitude, and we did an entire episode about gratitude. There's a lot of misunderstanding about gratitude. Oftentimes when people hear gratitude,
I sound like a parrot at this point, but Viktor Frankl, I should actually really look that up, psychologist, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, whatever, who was an inmate of a concentration camp back then and survived, fortunately, and him talking about how he did it. And the main point is having reason and having meaning, having a reason why you're surviving and having a meaning behind all of this. And I think it is some sort of in the same space as having a gratitude practice. I mean, having a reason why you're doing things probably is making you doing those things a bit easier. I mean, when I'm thinking about dopamine, when I'm thinking about serotonin, I kind of think about like trying to do certain things, trying to get certain things done and not quite being able to do so in terms of, well, probably not having the energy to do so and, well, quite the motivation. And how can you get motivation? Well, probably by having a reason why you're doing this in the first place and having purpose why you're doing this in the first place. So, maybe thinking about that as well, about the whole psychological side. I mean, this is neurochemistry and or biochemistry, whatever. But I think since there is a deep brain to body bond, it might also be quite necessary as well, not only useful and advisable, to check out psychological factors and psychological, things you can take advantage of by having meaning and or, well, even though, I mean, behavioral changes and behavioral things kind of also play into that at some point, I would assume. But yeah, still something I just wanted to point out. Definitely Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, a good book. It's probably kind of recommended by everyone at this point in time, but I think it's also useful to get perspective and see what this was like, that not only is, it's not only kind of non-fictional, like, okay, this is what you have to do to achieve this, that, and the other thing. No, this is not quite about that solely. Well, it may be part of it, having the advice and having the actionable advice, but also what was life like in a concentration camp, how were the people like, and so on and so forth, which is, really reframing one's mind in terms of, okay, where I am now, what is my life like? What am I doing at this point? And so on and so forth.
They think, oh, gratitude, this is just being thankful for what you have. And it's kind of a weak sauce effect, meaning, it's kind of like maybe a little serotonin goes up, or maybe there's a little bit of increased feelings of well-being. Nothing could be further from the truth. It turns out, first of all, that receiving, not giving gratitude, is what has the most potent effects on increasing serotonin and activity of the brain circuits that involve serotonin and that lead to increases in feelings of well-being. So it's interesting. Receiving, much more than giving gratitude, is what activates those serotonergic pathways. So the takeaway from that is both give and receive gratitude, and of course do it in an authentic way. The other thing about gratitude that's somewhat counterintuitive is that observing others giving and receiving gratitude is immensely powerful for evoking serotonin and the activity of serotonergic circuits in you, the observer. So receiving and observing gratitude turns out to be the most potent way to increase serotonin in the brain and body. And these, again, are dramatic effects that are quite long lasting and not the sorts of effects that are going to lead to side effects. At least there's no reason to think they would. Now, what about nutritional approaches to increasing serotonin? Well, just as we have tyrosine as an amino acid precursor upstream of dopamine synthesis, we have the amino acid tryptophan, which is upstream of serotonin synthesis. And one simply has to go online and put in tryptophan containing foods, and you will discover that there are a lot of foods that are enriched in tryptophan that can lead to net increases in the amount of serotonin available in the brain and body. The most kind of
let's check that out. Let's see what food we can find there. That's actually not that much that I have to type in to see that there apparently is also L-tryptophan as capsules, 500 milligram, also 500 milligram. Let's check out food. which might be useful. I don't know in which way you can keep that up. And he might also actually talk about that. There is also a bit of a caveat that I have to give you then, something to definitely check out, because I don't think that he's talking about that then. But there we can see, and I'm going to show you now, why you need tryptophan. No, I don't care. Mood, depression, learning, memory skills, visual cognition, aggression control, and probably many more things. I absolutely hate those sites where you're having to click through certain pages, and every time when you have to go back, or when you're willing to go back, you have to go through all of them. Might be strategic, but anyway. Milk, including 732 milligrams per quart. What is a quart? 2% reduced fat milk is also a good source, coming in at 551 milligrams per quart. Then canned tuna, turkey, and chicken oats, among many other nutritional reasons why oats are good. Cheese, nuts and seeds, bread, chocolate, fruits, and yada yada yada. Did he also talk about like the amount you need? I might have cut that off, but vitamin B3 or vitamins in general might also be something with a 6, I don't know, is also important to have to feel good. But yeah, anyway, dare they say. Most people consume more than double the amount that is actually needed, typically getting 900 to 1,000 milligrams per day, while the US recommended daily allowance is 250 to 425 milligrams per day. So, I'm sorry. So this should be doable, I think.
Famous or infamous of these is white meat turkey, the so-called tryptophan effect, where people get very sleepy after eating white meat turkey, and it is indeed highly enriched in tryptophan. Although typically the getting sleepy after eating turkey is most often associated with the Thanksgiving meal, and the Thanksgiving meal, at least in the US, is often associated with people vastly overeating. And so I do want to point out that if you fill your gut with food, no matter what that food is, there's going to be a diversion of blood to your gut that's going to make you feel sleepy, because there's a diversion of blood away from other tissues. So if you eat a lot, you're going to get sleepy, period, whether or not you eat turkey or some other substance. Nonetheless, there are a number of foods that contain a lot of tryptophan, and that some people will leverage in order to try and increase the total amount of circulating serotonin available to them in order to have a modest increase in overall mood and well-being. So what are some of these foods? These are things like milk, in particular whole milk, so full-fat milk. I know a number of people choose not to drink milk because they're lactose intolerant. I'm raising my hand because I'm one such person, although when I was a kid, I did enjoy milk.
Well, anyway, what I wanted to point out just before was your baseline dopamine, and I might, in the meantime, check where I can find some resources on that. Having baseline dopamine in check, meaning that your baseline dopamine is as high as possible. I think. Please take it with a grain of salt and do the fucking research. Dopamine levels. Having spikes in dopamine is shitty. Feeling really good at times and then really sinking down at some other point. Again, this is shitty because you're feeling quite shitty then. So probably keeping your baseline of dopamine, I would assume, as I said, take it with a grain of salt, quite high, but so high that it is not just, spiking all the time and then falling down again, might be useful. And there's actually an episode that also Huberman did on that, which might be something that he has indeed linked down there, which I found really useful and really interesting for a person that tends to feel pretty good about things and then feeling quite bad about things again as well, which is not that great, really, definitely not that great. But as I can see, the normal versus addicted brain. Maybe we can get something out of this thing here. The pursuit of pleasure, the normal versus addicted brain. Experiencing a pleasurable event, e.g. orgasm, results in a large spike in the dopamine level in the brain, with a quick return to normal level after the event, so the body is ready to enjoy another pleasurable event, as we can see here on the right, and I might zoom in a bit. Orgasm really spiking high, and then the return to baseline. This is the normal brain. The addicted brain set point is different. Thermostats is resets. Baseline may be higher or lower than normal. When an individual with an addicted brain has his or her first drug high, the dopamine level rises even higher than during orgasm. The high is even more intense and lasts longer than orgasm, but the dopamine level doesn't return to the normal baseline. It plunges to zero, no dopamine, and stays there. We equate this state to being a quicksand, and this is where addicted individuals lead their lives in quicksand. I don't know. This site does not look too fresh, so we may also take it with a grain of salt. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The high transforms into a corresponding low, and with each succeeding drug or alcohol event, the addicted person must use more and more to get less and less of an effect, which then is the so-called tolerance, or we build up a tolerance. Continues falling further and further until they are using not to get high, but just to get normal. With time, will take 75% of normal, then 50%. Just keep me out of the quicksand. Will do anything to avoid the withdrawal, the misery. Let's check. Predicts individual variation, baseline dopamine. Because I find it a bit disturbing now. Well, not disturbing, but a bit meh that I have forgotten about that, because I think it is a very important caveat. Baseline dopamine levels keep static, keep stable. Yeah, that's what I wanted to have. The best way is to increase dopamine levels naturally. Interactive effects of dopamine baseline levels and cycles. The key to happiness is dopamine baseline. Dopamine predicts individual blah blah blah. Simple method to measure baseline occupancy. Maybe this is a governmental site, so it might just be a paper. It probably is just a paper. I might also read the abstract for you there. Let's see. Or the findings. It's about the menstrual cycle. Yeah, definitely. I mean, hormones also do have something to do with that. How to increase dopamine naturally. Baseline dependent effect of dopamine precursor L-tyrosine. Also a bit more information on L-tyrosine there. Let me just see if I can find the Huberman Lab episode there. Huberman, dopamine supplements, ADHD. Controlling your dopamine for motivation. I think optimizing your brain chemistry, this should actually kind of be
retracted. It turns out that study.
Let me see. There's also caffeine, excitement, your dopamine set point, and your dopamine set point. Your pleasure, pain balance, and defining. This should probably be it.
Once we understand that dopamine is a driver for us to seek.
By the way, controlling your dopamine for motivation, focus, and satisfaction. Huberman Lab podcast number 39. Yeah.
Things. It makes perfect sense as to why it would have a baseline level and it would have peaks, and that the baseline and peaks would be related in some sort of direct way. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say that you were not alive now, but you were alive 10,000 years ago, and you woke up and you looked and you realized you had minimal water and you had minimal food left. Maybe you have a child, maybe you have a partner, maybe you're in an entire village, but you realize that you need things, okay? You need to be able to generate the energy to go seek those things. And chances are there were dangers in seeking those things. Yes, it could be saber-toothed tigers and things of that sort, but there are other dangers too. There's the danger of a cut to your skin that could lead to infection. There's the danger of storms. There's the danger of cold. There's the danger of leaving your loved ones behind. So you go out and forage, right? You could be hunting, you could be gathering, or you could be doing both. The going out and foraging process was, we are certain, driven by dopamine. I mean, there's no fossil record of the brain, but these circuits have existed, we know, for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And they are present in every animal, not just mammals, but even in little worms like C. elegans. The same process is mediated by dopamine. So dopamine drives you to go out and look for things. And then let's say you find a couple berries. These ones are rotten. These ones are good. Maybe you hunt an animal and kill it, or you find an animal that was recently killed and you decide to take the meat. You are going to achieve, or I should say experience, some sort of dopamine release. You found the reward. That's great. But then it needs to return to some lower level. Why? Well, because if you just stayed there, you would never continue to forage for more. It doesn't just increase your baseline and then stay there. It goes back down. And what's very important to understand is that it doesn't just go back down to the level it was before. It goes down to a level below what it was before you went out seeking that thing. Now, this is counterintuitive. We often think, oh, okay, I'm going to pursue the win, right? Let's move this to modern day. I'm going to run this marathon. I'm going to train for this marathon. Then you run the marathon and you cross the finish line. You feel great. And you would think, okay, now I'm set for the entire year. I'm going to feel so much better. I'm going to feel this accomplishment in my body. It's going to be so great. But that's not what happens. You might feel some of those things, but your level of dopamine has actually dropped below baseline. Now, eventually it will ratchet back up. But two things are really important. First of all, the extent to which it drops below baseline is proportional to how high the peak was. So if you cross the finish line pretty happy, it won't drop that much below baseline afterward. If you cross the finish line ecstatic, well, a day or two later, you're going to feel quite a bit lower than you would otherwise. You might not be depressed because it depends on where that baseline was to begin with. But the so-called postpartum depression that people experience after giving birth or after some big win, a graduation or any kind of celebration, that postpartum drop in mood and affect and motivation is the drop in baseline dopamine. This is very important to understand because this happens on very rapid timescales and it can last quite a long time. It also explains the behavior that most of us are familiar with of engaging in something that we really enjoy, going to a restaurant that we absolutely love, or engaging in some way with some person that we really, really enjoy. But if we continue to engage in that behavior over and over again, it kind of loses its edge. It starts to kind of feel less exciting to us. Some of us experience that drop in excitement more quickly and more severely than others, but everyone experiences that to some extent. And this has direct roots in these evolutionarily conserved inactivities or to consume things that evoke dopamine. And by no means am I encouraging people to take drugs of abuse. I would not do that. I am not doing that. Some of the things on these lists of dopamine evoking activities are things like chocolate, coffee, even if it's indirect, sex and reproduction, provided it's healthy, consensual, context appropriate, age appropriate, species appropriate, of course, is central to our evolution and progression as a species. So certain things like cocaine, amphetamine, I will put in the classification of bad. I'm willing to do that. And other things are part of life, food, exercise, if that evokes your dopamine. How are we supposed to engage with these dopamine evoking activities in ways that are healthy and beneficial for us? How do we achieve these peaks, which are so central to our well-being and experience of life without dropping our baseline? And the key lies in intermittent release of dopamine. The real key is to not expect or chase high levels of dopamine release every time we engage in these activities. Intermittent reward schedules are the central schedule by which casinos keep you gambling, the central schedule by which...
Also the same schedule in the same way, and he has talked about that before. Studying, learning, and working, having your own reward system, your inner intrinsic reward system, makes it possible to, study more, work more, probably also be more efficient and more effective, and so on and so forth, because, first of all, relying on outside extrinsic dopamine rewards or outside extrinsic rewards, they're not going to be there all the time. But when you're able to, and I think this is quite about reframing and also just, it's a mind game, to do this for yourself, having those small rewards for yourself. It's great. Period.
Elusive partners or potential partners keep you texting and pursuing on either side.
I wanted to say they keep you going, as the casino also keeps you going by having those small wins, and keeping your baseline quite high. Okay, the next time I'm probably going to get it as well, and so on and so forth. This might do the trick.
Of the relationship. Intermittent schedules are the way that the internet and social media, all highly engaging activities, keep you motivated and pursuing. And we can take this back to our evolutionary adaptive scenario where you are out there looking for water, looking for food. Not every trail, not every pursuit, not every hunch about where the animals will be, where the food will be, where the berries will be. Not every single one of those played out. There's something called dopamine reward prediction error. When we expect something to happen, we are highly motivated to pursue it. If it happens, great. We get the reward. The reward comes in various chemical forms, including dopamine. and we are more likely to engage in that behavior again. This is the basis of casino gambling. This is how they keep you going back again and again and again, even though on average, the house really does win. You can transplant that example to any number of different pleasureful activities. If you're not a gambler and that doesn't appeal to you, I have to imagine there's something that appeals to you, something that you do repeatedly because you enjoy it. And almost inevitably, it's because there's an intermittent schedule. There's an intermittent schedule by which dopamine sometimes arrives, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, sometimes a medium amount. Okay? That intermittent reinforcement schedule is actually the best schedule to export to other activities. How do you do that? Well, first of all, if you are engaged in activities, school, sport, relationship, etc., where you experience a win, you should be very careful about allowing yourself to experience huge peaks in dopamine unless you're willing to suffer the crash that follows and waiting a period of time for it to come back up. What would this look like in the practical sense? Well, let's say you are somebody who really does enjoy exercise. Or let's say you're somebody who kind of likes exercise but forces yourself to do it, but you make it pleasureful by giving yourself your favorite cup of coffee first, or maybe taking a pre-workout drink, or taking an energy drink, or listening to your favorite music. And then you're in the gym and you're listening to your music. That all sounds great, right? Well, it is great, except that by layering together all these things to try and achieve that dopamine release, and by getting a big peak in dopamine, you're actually increasing the number of conditions required to achieve pleasure from that activity again. And so there is a form of this where sometimes you do all the things that you love to get the optimal workout. You listen to your favorite music, you go at your favorite time of day, you have your pre-workout drink if that's your thing, you do.
And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're just working out and you're doing your thing. And I think the metaphor of, okay, I'm having separate basically an infinite amount of paths that I can walk to find my food. And sometimes I get my food and sometimes I don't. I think this is exactly the same thing this is, sometimes having a workout that's, maybe very pleasureful, and sometimes having one that isn't. Might also be applicable to other things. Sometimes studying something, learning something that is really difficult, and you're not probably, at least the chances are not that high, getting those dopamine peaks because you're not, remembering things as easily and whatnot. And maybe then just jumping to a section where things are a bit easier to basically keep yourself going. Unless one is able, and this is going to be the end for today, unless one is able to actually have this, as I said before, intrinsic motivation, this ability to see that the obstacle is the way. With that being said, I'm hoping we're going to see you the next time pretty soon, and wish you the best. So I always have to wait a bit. When I end the stream now, it gets cut off, and I'm not having it in my recording, nor probably in the stream as well. So